from army service, and we really began the first unit kind of looking at the question from the sources, from the Tanakh, looking at the obligation to fight, obligatory mitzvot to fight. Hi, Daniel. And how that kind of plays out in this discussion. And last time we moved on to look at the kinds of claims made by like, I guess today you would say the more Haredi groups that suggest that well, Torah scholars are actually should be exempt or are exempt, perhaps like B'nai Levi, perhaps like these kind of spiritual people that worship only in the Mikdash based on the Rambam. And looked at those kinds of things. And also, interestingly, last time, if you remember, we finished by looking at in the beginning of the state, who was arguing for it. And interestingly, we found that Rav Herzog and some of the big Mizrahi rabbis, Rav Herzog being the first chief rabbi of Israel, originally from Ireland, right? He was the chief rabbi in Ireland. And he was one of the people that pressed Ben Gurion that said, that after the destruction of European Jewry, this is what we need. And Ben Gurion himself gave testimony to the fact that he decided based on the arguments of the Mizrahi rabbis. And so not all rabbis, Mizrahi rabbis, were in favor of military service for B'nai Yeshivot. But that obviously is in 1948 and a bit later. And that therefore is a different kind of case. And also we finished last time by looking at the famous incident between Ben Gurion and the Chazon Ish about drafting, and at that point it was really talking about drafting of women to the army, religious women to the army, who until today enjoy an exemption throughout in Israel. Anyone who's gone to a religious girls' school is exempt from the army. And we noted that there are different versions of the story of what happened. Ben Gurion, for what he didn't actually have to meet the Chazon Ish. It's not clear why he did it. The Chazon Ish didn't have the political power that today's Gedolim have. At that time, it wasn't like it is today, but he wanted to go and he met the Chazon Ish, and and he asked the Chazon Ish the famous question, what are you meant to do that you have different Jews in the state of Israel who come from different worldviews? How are you meant to kind of make a go of it? And the Chazon Ish famously answered him the story from the Gemara from Sanhedrin about two wagons that come to a narrow bridge. One is fully laden and one is empty, and they both meet in the middle of the bridge, and the one who's empty needs to give way and let the one that's full go through. The intention being that the traditional Jewish life is the wagon laden with produce that needs to be let through because they come with this heavy burden. And that's normally how the story is told in more Haredi circles and also even in religious Zionist circles. That's how the story is told, and that's how it ends, right? But actually the secretary of Ben Gurion was there with him, and he said, well, Ben Gurion wasn't a num-num, as we would say in Hebrew, right? Ben Gurion built the state. He was a real fighter. And so he answered, but what about mitzvah teshuva? What about settling the land? What about defending the land of Israel and Am Yisrael? Isn't that also part of what's in the wagon of the secular Jews? And the Chazon Ish answered him, Hashem lo yishmor ir shav shakat shomer, right? If God won't protect the city, then it was all for naught. And that's kind of how this meeting ended. But in there, you see these tensions, right? In that story. And so, regardless of the sources, right? Although obviously we're bound by sources, but you see that this tension exists, right? And even in the modern period, and when this question arose, it wasn't so simple that B'nai Yeshivot should be drafted, and there were those that argued against it and those that argued for it. But together with that, there's also this claim that actually, it's not that the secular Jews aren't doing anything. Secular Jews defending the land of Israel, and also religious Jews should defend the lives of Am Yisrael as is required by halacha. And so the question is really a murky one. What we're going to look at today, in Yirtzeh Hashem, is a third way, right? A third way, which is presented by the Tilumi, the Mizrahi, perhaps as the ideal. But even that, I'm not sure is true. But in general, this is one of the ideals of the Mizrahi in Israel, which is Hesder, something called Hesder. Hesder in Hebrew meaning Hesder, right? A compromise or an arrangement, literally an arrangement, whereby religious soldiers go to yeshiva for a 5-year period, and in that period, they're essentially drafted into the army for the entire period. They spend out of those 5 years, it changes from time to time. They spend about 2 years in the army proper, even though they're technically soldiers for the entire time, but they're not in the army. The yeshiva is kind of like the army for them, and they're in the army proper for 2 years, and they're in the yeshiva for the rest of the time. They're not allowed to work during that time. They're not allowed to do anything else. And that's what we call Hesder, which is something that happened in the 70s, essentially, and developed. And that's the maslul I was in. And I'll just tell you personally, we're going to read this article from Liechtenstein. This article, I saw recently a rabbi friend of mine called Rav Aaron Leibovitz from Yerushalayim. He posted a question on Facebook recently. He said, has there ever been anything that's convinced you or changed your opinion of anything? Have you ever actually engaged in a conversation with someone and because of that conversation changed what you think? Which is a good question. I mean, how many of us actually can say, I had a conversation with so-and-so and I actually changed what I thought. I actually think differently now because of it. And it was a good question. But I have to honestly say that in my own personal journey, this article influenced my direction entirely. In terms of my army service. I did university in Australia, and I plan to go to Israel and spend time learning, and also go to the army. And because of this article, I decided I dafka wanted to go through the route of Hesder because I saw it as an ideal. And so that's kind of the place where I'm coming from. And it's a very interesting article because it deals with a lot of the issues we've seen until now, but also deals with the practicalities, right? Okay, so it's all good and well. You have this ideology of not compromise, but an ideology which sees military service as important, as Torah learning is important. Let's come and meet in the middle, right? And come out with something that's like a 5-year program that involves also service and also Torah learning and does that work, right? And so, well, we could sit here and say, yes, it's the best, and it is the best in many ways, but at the same time, there's also a price you pay for compromise, if that makes sense, right? There are other ways that other yeshivot deal with the army, right? They don't all sign on for 5 years. Some of them say, no, you learn for 3 years in the yeshiva, and 3 years go and do full army service with everyone else, right? And there's a certain price you pay for compromise. And I think looking at this question through that lens is important as well when we're considering the ideology of the Mizrahi, I guess you would say, the ideology of modern orthodoxy, right? What price do you pay for compromising? Right? Or what price do you pay to, I wouldn't use the word compromise because I don't think the Mizrahi and the modern Orthodox see the ideology as a compromise. I think they see it as the striving to achieve two ideals at the same time, right? I guess that's a better way to phrase it. But in that, there is a kind of a compromise, right? You can't be everything at once, right? As nice and as true as the entire, idea of tzvei dinim is in learning, right? It doesn't always work like that in practice. And so I think also what's so nice about the article from Liechtenstein, we're just going to jump around it, is how he navigates that question. I think that's also important in of itself for us to look at. How does Rav Liechtenstein deal with these compromises or with these issues? How does he dance between them? And that in of itself, aside from the question of being drafted to the army, aside from the question of Hesder and all these other things, it's important from a mono-orthodox perspective to think about, well, how do we navigate these poles, and what does that do to us? What does that say to us? And I think Rav Liechtenstein presents an ideal in that sense as well. Does anyone want to say anything or comment?
I just was interested to know, what was your thought about Hesder before you read that article? Why had you not considered Hesder up to that point?
Good question. Well, firstly, when I went to the army, I was older. I was 22 when I drafted, 23. And I had gone to university, and it was important for me to learn a lot, and I saw that as kind of where I was going. It was important for me to serve in the army, and I never really considered Hesder. I thought it was, maybe I also thought it was a bit of a compromise, if that makes sense, right? A bit of, you try to do half of everything, you end up with not really a full thing. But yeah, what were you going to say, Aaron?
I was just going to say, at that age and coming from Kutzwitz, you probably could have done the same amount of service not through Hesder.
Yeah, I mean,
as in you could have done the 2.
Yeah, there are other things that are peculiar to my case in that I Dafka wanted to serve for a significant period of time in a combat unit and a few other things that was important for me even at that age. And we can maybe talk about how that was for a 22-year-old being commanded by someone who was younger than him in a combat unit, and stuff like that. I'll just say, like on the side, like a bit of an anecdote, which is really funny. So the classic way of doing Hesder was that all the yeshiva guys would be together in the unit, if that makes sense. You know, in the army you have like platoons and I don't know what you call them in English, brigades or whatever it is, right? And so the classic way of doing Hesder, which is part of the kind of trying to navigate the poles, is that all the frum guys, all the yeshiva guys are together, right? And that kind of makes it easier in a military setting to to be makpid on certain things and everything else. But when I went into the army, there was a move to try and kind of bring everyone together. And so I was in a unit that was in each platoon, we had what you call a kippah, which I guess is like a team of what in Hebrew you call them benishim. Benishim is the army way of saying bnei yeshivot, right? So you had like a team of benishim. And so I was in a situation where I had 18-year-olds, right, together with the Hesder guys who were older, right? Hesder guys draft when they're about 21 or something, or 20, and so they're a bit older. But I was in a different headspace at that point, to be honest. I was in a headspace that, like, I thought the 18-year-olds were very immature, right? And they were, but like the Hesder guys were like so serious about the whole thing, and it was I was kind of in between those two places. So it made for an interesting experience. We can talk about that another, navigating military life when you're a bit older and Australian, I think, and not Israeli. Yeah, and so I never really considered Hesder for myself, but after reading this article, it actually swayed me very much, and I feel very committed to the ideology of Hesder. And so we're going to read, again, looking at how Rav Lichtenstein deals with some of the issues, looking at how he navigates, which I think is the most interesting thing that comes out of this, and how he addresses the issues, which I think is a very honest approach, actually. And we've spoken about this before in our various shiurim, that I think one of the things which is very important to Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Lichtenstein is this kind of intellectual honesty. And so we're gonna jump around a little bit. Please feel free to stop or whatever if you want to. It's called The Ideology of Hesder, and he writes in the beginning here that there would have been no reason after the Yom Kippur War to discuss the merits of Hesder. It was clear to everyone what Hesder did, right, in the Yom Kippur War. And that, by the way, is, just so you understand, part of the thinking behind the army, at least in the early years of Hesder, which is, why would the army do this, right? We understand why it's perhaps good for us, for the Bnei Yeshivot to want to learn, but why would the army agree to it? Why would they agree to shorten the time of military service, but have guys kind of bound to the army for 5 years in yeshivot? And one of the reasons, which I don't know if it still holds today, but one of the reasons was not only because they considered the fighters to be braver from the yeshivot and everything else, but that's something else to discuss, but was that they needed a place where if a war broke out, they could call people who would be readily available, right? And so the people in the yeshivot, they live in the yeshivot. You don't have to go around drafting people and collecting them from their houses. You just say, okay, you've had military training, you're in the yeshiva for 5 years, and now a war breaks out in your 4th year, we can just pick you up and send you to the front. And so that was obviously very important in the Yom Kippur War. Okay, so almost everyone had read comments by Officer Tzal. This is in the 70s, praising the courage and commitment of Bnei Yeshivot, noting the inspirational qualities, have done so much to boost collective morale, and the vital role in the actual fighting. And there was, of course, a litany of suffering, the statistics, the highly disproportionate casualties of the yeshiva students, to attest in the context of the pervasive status and pride, the ideological representation of Hesder seemed largely unnecessary, the reality spoke for itself. And so he's writing now in a time much later when those kinds of things are kind of in the distant past, and people ask, and still today people ask, well, why do we need Hesder, right? Why should the state do it? And getting onto our questions before of, well, B'nai Shivot are not exempt from military service al pi halacha, and we buy into that concept, then why should there be a difference between those in the yeshiva and those out of the yeshiva in terms of serving in the army? And let's see what he says. So he says, of the three courses, right, the first course being complete army service, the second course being exemption because of learning in yeshiva, the third course, he says there, is in one sense perhaps the easiest. Properly speaking, however, it is also the most arduous. The advantages judged from a student's perspective are fairly clear. Most obviously, the tour of actual army service is shorter. That's true even today. While a student is tied down for Hesder for almost 5 years, he only spends, unless he becomes an officer, about 16 months in uniform. That's changed. So it's about 22 months, I think. Most important, however, Hesder provides a convenient framework for discharging two different and to some extent conflicting obligations. It enables the student morally and psychologically to salve both his religious and his national conscience by sharing in the collective defense burden without cutting himself off from the matrix of Torah study, right? And so here he notes that Hesder is in some ways, it's more difficult, but at the same time, it allows them to fulfill both. And this, of course, has religious implications. Hesder offers him a desirable context. For while in the army, he will often be stationed with fellow Hesdernikim, and Hesder enables pragmatically to keep his future academic and vocational options open, right? These are legitimate, important considerations, right? He says, it's legitimate to think about what's going to be after the yeshiva, to think about what's going to be in our life and how it's going to affect you. And if you only go to yeshiva where you don't serve in the army, later on it affects you in terms of the career choices. But they are not what Hesder ideally considered is all about. Properly understood, Hesder poses more of a challenge than an opportunity. And in order to perceive it at its best, we need to focus upon difficulty and even tension rather than upon convenience. And I think in that phrase, it also says a lot about modern orthodoxy in general, right? Modern orthodoxy, properly understood, poses more of a challenge than an opportunity, right? And we need to focus upon difficulty and tension rather than convenience. Hesder does not merely provide a religious cocoon for young men fearful of being contaminated by the potentially secularizing influence of general army life, but it does serve that need as well. Again, and I've said this before, I think we need to be aware of the practical implications of ideology, not just be ideological, but think about, what does it mean, right? And how do we do it? And sometimes ideologically you need to do A, but practically it would harm your Avodat Hashem, so you do B. And that's important also in Hesder. Hesder at its finest seeks to attract and develop B'nai Torah, who are profoundly motivated by the desire to become serious Talmidei Chachamim, but who can currently feel morally and religiously bound to help defend their people and their country, who, given the historical exigencies of their time and place, regard this dual commitment as both a privilege and a duty, who, in comparison with their non-Hesder confreres, love not, to paraphrase Shakespeare, Torah less, but Israel more. It provides the context in which students can focus upon enhancing the personal, spiritual, and intellectual growth while heeding the call to public service, right? And so I feel that very strongly, right? This dual commitment to Torah and also to serving and helping Am Yisrael. To be sure, the two aspects of Hesder, the spiritual and the military, are hardly on a par. Primarily, however, concerns the realm of value within which two elements, each indispensable, may yet be variously regarded. When the Mishnah states, "Im ein kemach ein Torah, im ein Torah ein kemach," right? It hardly means that both are equally important, right? And this is crucial. Because oftentimes, and this actually comes from certain ideological camps of the Mizrahi, of the Dati-Leumi, of the religious Zionists, right? They do see military service, not on a par with Torah study, but as an ideal. And Rav Lichtenstein comes out quite strongly here that shouldn't be the case, right? What it does mean is that both are in fact equally necessary, although axiologically and teleologically flower exists for the sake of Torah, right? And so, the yeshiva prescribes military service as a means to an end. It's not military service for its own sake. And he does say this, we don't value military service like other cultures do. The Greeks and the Romans felt that, ideally everyone should go to the military as a way of preparing them for life. And he comes out very strongly that that's not the case. In one sense, therefore, insofar as army service is alien to the ideal Jewish vision, Hesder is grounded in necessity rather than choice. It is, if you will, b'diavad, right? Because of political reality. In another sense, however, it is very much lechatchila, a freely willed option grounded in a moral and halachic decision. We at Har Etzion, the Gush, do not advocate Hesder as a second alternative for those unable, unwilling to the rigors of Torah. We advocate it because we're convinced that given our circumstances, would that they be better. Military service is a mitzvah and the most important one of that. Without impugning the patriotism or ethical posture of those who think otherwise, we feel that for the overwhelming majority of B'nai Torah, defense of Israel is a moral imperative, right? And he comes out quite strongly here, as you'll see on the side of what we've been speaking about, at least for the majority of B'nai Torah, almost everyone. Defending Am Yisrael is a moral imperative and also a mitzvah, right? And you can't abrogate that. Of course, right? And he says, Hesder is not the result of compromise between the respective Rosh Yeshiva and Ministry of Defense. It's a compromise with reality. We do occasionally argue with the generals over details, and they do not always sufficiently appreciate the preeminence of the spiritual factor. The basic concern with security, however, is ours no less than theirs, of course. That concern must be balanced against others. Knesset Yisrael needs not only security, but spirituality, and ultimately the former for the sake of the latter. Those who, by dint of knowledge and inspiration, are able to preserve and enrich our moral vision and spiritual heritage, contribute incalculably to the quality of our national life. And I think that point needs to be highlighted, right? The Tilumi, or the approach of the Mizrahi, is not in conflict with the Haredi worldview in terms of the preeminence of Torah study, right, and the importance of spirituality in the life of Am Yisrael. In fact, it is vitally, vitally important. And the only question is, are you exempt? Are you exempt? And obviously, we can see it feels like that it's a mitzvah to serve in the army. But then how do you balance it, right? Is it possible to balance it? Perhaps part of the Haredi argument today would be you can't balance it. You can't be a Ben Torah and someone that serves in the military, right? It's impossible for that to be the case. But perhaps we would say it needs to be the case. It needs to be the case. And I think just, as I don't know if I sound critical for those who dodge military service or seek an exemption, but I do think that the claim is an important one to make, especially in the modern Western capitalist society we live in, where the life of the spirit, I'm not only talking about Torah, I'm talking in general, is not considered valuable, right? And if anyone who wants to know what that means in practice, you can go to your average humanities department, lahavdil, at a university, and try and see, the number of courses that are offered versus how many were offered 50 years ago, right? And the number of students who are interested in those courses, it's largely being pushed to the side. In some cases, effectively, they don't even exist. Humanities courses, and Torah, right? Torah obviously is not like humanities, mamash not. But that could also happen in our world, right? To say, well, high tech's important. We have the state. Who cares about spirituality? Who cares about Torah? But the kind of counterculture which the Haredim present, right? And also the Mizrahi, but is no. We need people who are learning and dedicated to spirituality and knowledge, inspiration, moral vision. Skip the next page. So he says, though, is the fact that this he explains just on a practical level. People criticize Hesder from the other side, which is, why are you getting off, right? Who gives you the right to, okay, if defending Am Yisrael is important, you need to defend Am Yisrael. Don't sit in the yeshiva. Don't take less time in the army. And here he explains that actually, militarily, Hesder is significant. This was when he was writing, and today even more so. And I will say also, today most commanders recognize the kind of the inspiration that the Hesder people bring to the units, right? Because also today in Israel, there are oftentimes not a large proportion of soldiers, but there is a significant minority proportion of soldiers that they're not really sure why they're even there, right? And to have a group of people who come to the army dedicated and also a bit more mature and kind of with the moral vision is very important for the military today, together with their numbers, right? Today they number more than 400 tanks in the army. although I'm not sure exactly. In determining whether and when the study of Torah should be set aside in favor of a mitzvah, efshar la'asot al yedei acherim, the extent to which it can be realized by others is a crucial factor. And now he's talking about, okay, well, not everyone has to serve in the army today. Not everyone has to. You can have a group of people in the army, and you can have the people learning, which is also something which is heard in the more Haredi areas of Israeli society. However, that possibility should be real and not merely theoretical. And in assessing it, their readiness to take up the slack should presumably be considered. It is by no means certain that I may compel others, directly or indirectly, to assume my share of a common task so that I can continue my studies. Right. Further, the problem requires a wholly different dimension when what is at issue is not just the distribution of time and effort, but the possibility of danger. Right. And this element is unfortunately present even in times of presumed peace. And here he kind of states in a way which we haven't seen before, I think, in the previous Hurim, this kind of basic assumption. It's true. You might say, okay, other people can do it, right? Other people can serve in the army and we can have a group of people studying. He says, but firstly, it's not clear that you can even do that. You can say, well, you go do that and I'll study if that's even possible, right? But he says there's also an element of danger. And when one's life is on the line, you can't compare the two. And that needs to be part of what's going on in our conversations, right? In our kind of moral voice, right? And he says, consequently, in determining the duration of peacetime service, we're driven back to balancing conflicting communal needs. And this is the basis of its abbreviation in Hesder. He explains why is it that there's less time served in active duty in Hesder than in other army programs. And he says, because you need to balance conflicting needs in times of peace. In times of war, it's clear. Everyone goes to fight, but in times of peace, in Israel isn't exactly times of peace, but in times of peace, you can kind of balance it and play between. It should be clear, and this is an important line at the end here. It should be clear, however, that the concept of Efshar La'asota provides no mandate for categorical dispensation. He says, the idea of Efshar La'asota, so get other people to do it while you learn or whatever it is, can't be in a blanket exemption. It might be one time or another, but it can't be a way of life. Those who strike this balance and conclude that they owe no peacetime service whatsoever are, of course, entitled to their position. But I must confess that I, for one, do not find the notion of a free of charge state morally engaging, right? And those lines, it's very characteristic of Rav Lichtenstein, right? Those lines are very potent, right? But they're said very nicely. I don't find the notion of a free of charge state morally engaging is I guess to say the least. Does anyone want to comment or say anything? No. Okay. And then he goes on and says something else, which I think is important to note as well. Do we see Hesder as an ideal? Do we see it as something which is part and parcel of Jewish life? And he says this, nevertheless, although our centuries of statelessness tend to obscure this fact, Hesder is the traditional Jewish way. What were the milieu of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Yeshua, of David, of Rabbi Akiva, as Chazal conceived and described them, but Yeshivot Hesder? The mode of integrating military service with the study of Torah may very well have differed from our own. Chazal described Yeshua as being reproached for having omitted a single evening of communal Talmud Torah in his camp. And as an army, we are unfortunately quite far from this standard. Nevertheless, the principle is very much the same, right? And that's the other element of this. Throughout the exile, when a Jew was faced with military service, and I spoke about this in the very beginning, and I said the questions of Jews serving in foreign militaries at all is a very modern question, right? But for the 2,000 years we were in exile, this question was not really relevant, right? And so people could be mistaken for thinking, that the Torah scholars are exempt from certain things in communities, but in a time of when you have a state, things change, and you need to go back in the sources to before, right? To before the exile and look at how we dealt with things. And here he's arguing, I think quite convincingly, right, that Moshe Rabbeinu, Yeshua, and David, and to some extent Rabbi Akiva, saw Yeshivot Hesder as an ideal, not in the way we perhaps conceive them, but this ideal that it's not just Torah. There needs to be Torah and also actions. And Torah and war sometimes need to go hand in hand, and in that sense, it's important. And then he goes on and says something here as well, which I think is a very important point, something which we didn't touch on. And he says the halachic rationale for Hesder does not, as some mistakenly assume, rest solely upon the mitzvah of waging defensive war. If that were the case, one might conceivably argue that halachically 16 months of service is too high a price to pay for the performance of the single commandment. The rationale actually rests upon the simple need for physical survival and the fact that military service is often the fullest manifestation of a broader value, gemilut chasadim, a concern from others. And he goes through and brings this famous teaching Chazal, right, that that social ethics, right, is more important, right? That one who concerns himself solely with Torah is as one who has no God. The Midrash equates the renunciation of Gemilut Chasadim with blasphemy, right? And so oftentimes when we think about, are you exempt, are you not exempt, can you do it, can you get away with it, what the answer is, we're not talking about that. We're not talking even about the mitzvah to wage war. The discussion which we're having, and I did kind of allude to this in the very beginning when I spoke about Bnei Reuven, right? And that they want to go, they want to live on the other side of the Jordan. And Moshe says, "Will your brothers go before you?" And they say, "No, we'll go first in the camp, and then we'll return." Right? What I said there was that's not really a halachic proof for the need to serve in the army. I said that's just a basic moral requirement of people. Right? Can it be that your brothers go in front of you and you don't go out to fight? And it's kind of the same here, but here Rav Lichtenstein hammers it home even more. And that is, serving in the military isn't only because it's a mitzvah to go out and fight, it's because it's part of Gemilut Chasadim, right? And we saw here in the Gemara that he brought, right, the Gemilut Chasadim, if you renounce that, it's akin to blasphemy. What is equally obvious is the fact that not everyone draws these implications, and this for one of several reasons. Some, not many, I hope, simply have little, if any, concern with the state of Israel. Even entertain the naive notion that as one Rosh Yeshiva put it, their business could continue as usual with Palestinian flags fluttering from the rooftops, right? And others feel that the spiritual price, personal and communal, is simply too high, and that first-rate Torah leadership can only be developed in a monochromatic context of pure yeshivot, right? And so here he's dealing with the people who come and say, no, firstly, Zionism doesn't matter, and he says hopefully those aren't the majority, right? But also you can't develop real Torah leadership only in such a world. So I was contend that from the perspective of genuine faith and trust in God, the yeshivot are the true guardians of the polity, and any compromise of their integrity is a blow at national security. These contentions clearly raise a number of basic moral, halachic, and theological issues with respect to which I obviously entertain certain views, right? Again, I brought this here as well because to see how Rav Lichtenstein talks, right, and how he deals with it. However, I do not wish at this juncture to polemicize. These are matters on which honest men of Torah can differ seriously out of mutual respect, right? And I think, again, he's not just saying this. He really believes this, right? He really, right? You can, he has his opinion and you can dispute with people with mutual respect. And I certainly have no desire to denigrate those who do not subscribe to my position. What I do wish to stress minimally, however, is the point that for the aspiring Talmid Chacham, Hesder is at least as legitimate as path as any other. It is, to my mind, a good deal more, but surely not less. And in that statement, I think Rav Lichtenstein is giving an honest appraisal, right? When he's thinking about his own project at Yeshivat Har Etzion, which is a Hesder yeshiva, right? And thinking about whether army service does take away from the ability to create Talmidei Chachamim, and he doesn't think that's true, right? He obviously coming through here doesn't think that's true. We might disagree, right? You might disagree with me on this point, he says. But for the aspiring Talmid Chacham, it's at least a legitimate path, at least, and even more because of all the other things that it brings with it in terms of giving back to Am Yisrael and the nature of Gemilut Chasadim. And he goes in there, carries on to discuss some of the things we've already looked at, and we're not going to talk about it because we've already spoken about it. Are Talmidei Chacham exempt? Are they not exempt? And he provides explanations for why that is, including the famous Rambam that mentions that Levim are exempt. And he says, we'll read here what he says. He says, first, the initial postulate, sorry, let me skip. He says, even if this contention is rejected, however, the Rambam statement remains largely irrelevant to the contemporary problem of Hesder. For it should be noted, third, that the spirituality of Levite does not preclude military service entirely. Right, and he's talking there, and he says, even if you go on and you say that Rambam is right, and it isn't just Agadatan, it is halacha that the Levium are exempt. He says that wouldn't exclude it entirely, right? And mostly can be exempt from the gamut of wars within the mitzvah of milchama, right? But has no bearing upon his duty to help fight or prevent a defensive war or that threatens the survival of his communities and his peers, is a spiritual order excused from saving human lives, right? And that is a very important point. How can you say that Levim are, if someone's dying in the street, well, no, we're Levim, we don't deal with anything like that. We go on our way, right? And obviously that isn't the case. And he says, finally, even if we grant, and this is important, even grant that the Rambam statement does imply a dispensation in purely halachic terms, right? Even if we assume that it's true, but he's already shown it isn't, it remains of little practical significance. We've yet to examine just to whom it applies. A Levi is defined genealogically. Those who are equated with him, however, literally or symbolically, are defined by spiritual qualities. And for these, the Rambam sets a very high standard indeed. He presents an idealized portrait of a selfless, a temporal, almost ethereal person, one whose spirit and intelligence have led him to divest himself of all worldly concerns, right? And he says, to how large a segment of the Torah community or a fortiori of any community does this lofty typology apply? 2%, 5%? Can anyone who has negotiated the terms of a salary, perhaps even of a Naden or Kest or both, look into a mirror and tell himself that he need not go to the army because he's Kodesh Kadoshim? In the Rambam's terms, can anyone with even a touch of vanity or concern for kavod contend this? And again, he's not coming across, I don't read him this way, as kind of saying, how can you say this? You Haredim to learn. He's saying, honestly, honestly, can anyone say that, right? And is that really the way to suggest that the large proportions of populations fall into the category of the Leviim, right? And he says, I don't have anything against economic aspirations, right? And I don't want to single out B'nai Shivot for undeserved moral censure. I do feel, however, that those who would single themselves out for exemption from normal duties on the grounds of saintliness should examine their credentials by the proper standards, right? And on that point, he finishes. So let's just skip to the end. And he says, at the end here, sorry, let me just, and this is how he ends. The way he ends, I think, is a very beautiful way to end, right? And so just before we get to the ending, just to take a step back and think about what he said. He's dealt with the actual text, although we skipped that part because we dealt with it in other shiurim, right? But you see how he navigates this tension and this question of Hesder, right? And the accommodation, is it even morally justifiable to have a shortened service? And he explains why he feels that it is. Is it morally justifiable to go to the army? And he explains why he thinks it's mitzvah, even though he doesn't think it's a moral imperative to the building of a human being. And he also talks about, the practical difficulties, right? How you negotiate these things and why Hesder is good, even from practical terms and things you need to be concerned about. And I think his way is darchei noam, right? In a very simple way, right? But navigating a very important question and a very kind of tense question in the modern state of Israel. And he just ends like this. He says, hence, in the context of our station and its duties, to use F.H. Bradley's terms, right? Obviously, we can see how a doctorate in English literature, as there is for B'nai Torah, the imperative of the moment. And he says as follows, may God grant us a better station, right? In the meantime, however, if it is to become no worse, we must keep both our spirits and our guard up. Animated by vision and yet chary of danger, we of Yeshivot Hesder pray that he may grant us the wisdom and the courage to cope with the challenges of the time, fully appreciative of both the price we pay and the value of that which we safeguard in return. We approach our task with responsibility and humility, and impelled both by commitment to Torah and compassion for our people, we strive to fulfill it with a sense of broader spiritual and historical vision. And this is the line, standing in tears atop Har HaZeitim, the bleak sight of Kol HaMekudash Michavero, Charev Yoter Michavero, right? Stretching before him, what would the Ramban had given to head a Yeshivat Hesder, right? And that's how he ends his very powerful piece, I think. And that point of the Ramban, right, who comes to Eretz Yisrael and he sees the destruction of the Jewish gravestones, right? And he sees essentially the destruction of Am Yisrael. He says, what would he have given to be ahead of a Yeshivat Hesder? Everything aside, right? And I think that also rings true, we need to recognize how fortunate we are to live in a modern state of Israel. We need to recognize and also what that means for us, what that necessitates upon us, right? Also in the realm of the spirit and also in the realm of the Maaseh. And that for me was something that I found very very meaningful, and I still believe in it in a lot of ways today. The need for Hesder as an ideal, although not for everyone. Some people perhaps are better suited to other tracks. Yeah, I'm interested to hear what you think, or comments, questions. We kind of raced through it, but it's I can send the articles before if you want. Daniel, you have your hand up.
And I can still. Do you have an idea what does cost the state more, the Hesder program, the yeshiva program, or the pure military program? Is there a price tag can there be a price tag on anyone?
I don't know. Like the Hesder program does cost the military, because the military pays the yeshivot a certain amount for the housing and food of the people in the yeshiva. So there is, it's not free in that sense, although I didn't pay, but the families also pay the yeshivot, because it's not enough to maintain the yeshiva, so to speak. And so it's but I'm not sure how it compares to military salaries, actually. And it's that kind of thing I think is very difficult to analyze. I'm certainly not going to try it on one foot. In terms of the yeshiva, the regular yeshiva, the Haredi yeshivot, the state also pays them, I think, certain amounts for tuition and things like that. So I don't know exactly. The question though is also, what does the state receive, if that makes sense, right? So yeah. The Hesder yeshivot provide a source of fighters that can also be used in an emergency. And the regular military also is a significant amount of fighters, but after 3 years, they're no longer there, and then they go to Miluim. Yeah, there are all these kinds of considerations. I'm not sure.
But basically, the yeshiva bachurim are the cheapest for the state. From a state point of view, they pay the less for those who don't go to the military, right?
They pay less for those, in terms of the army itself?
I mean, whilst these bachurim are in yeshiva, does the state pay for anything actually?
Yeah, I think they do pay a certain amount to the yeshivot for each student, because they're technically soldiers, right? Like when I was in the yeshiva, I was officially a soldier. I had to have a soldier ID card on me. I wasn't in the framework of the army, except if the army needed to, they could officially take me, but they don't. There's a certain time when they normally do it, unless it's a war or something like that. So again, I don't know the exact amounts, but there is a money factor, but I don't know if that's where this kind of I don't think there's no discussion in Israel about that Hesder isn't worth it, if that makes sense.
But by who? By or by everyone?
Yeah, by everyone. It's not a real discussion. Again, it might need to be a discussion. I don't know. It's a good question.
Because I had sorry to take time, but
that's okay.
I was actually in a discussion with someone in Manchester who has got like left-wing views.
Yeah, sure.
And he said
we also talk to such people. Not hopefully not more than a minute, but
very, very quickly. And so he said his argument was the whole thing about encouraging religious people, and especially Haredim, to join the army is completely unpractical because it's far too expensive for the state. Can you agree with this?
Yes and no. Obviously, more religious populations have different needs in the army that makes them more complicated. The real problem with the Haredim specifically, again, this is not the topic, but is that it's not the army that's the issue. It's the later on in life that's the issue, right? So if someone goes through school and doesn't learn English or mathematics, and then doesn't go to the military and can only possibly work in a very low-paying job after that, if at all, It means that the state doesn't benefit from taxes, and that's really the concern today. I think that's at least what people say, but I don't know how true that is. You have to be careful with how these things are phrased, and everything's political, as you know. But having said that, there are two things I will say about Hesder which are important to think about. I mentioned it before, that and I'm not just saying this because I was in Hesder, right? But there is an important role that Hesder soldiers play in terms of the morale on the ground, right? And the number of officers which come out of the Hesder yeshivot later on and stay longer in the military, and their kind of commitment and morale, because they do come with a different ideological package than your average Israeli, right? And
But that's not necessarily Hesder.
what?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
That's not necessarily Hesder. That could just be the fact that they're coming from the Dati Leumi background.
No. There are other military tracks that or like if people, they'll go to yeshiva for 3 years to Bnei Eli or Bnei David or whatever in Eli, and then they'll just go join the army, right? And you're right. That doesn't dafka have to come from Hesder. But there is and by the way, the army also supports those yeshivot in various ways, what you would call the mechinot, which are not Hesder yeshivas, but they're like yeshivot that prepare you before the army, and then you go to the army, and also a lot of people go through there as well. But so not dafka Hesder, but oftentimes commanders, if you speak with them, they're like, oh, I'm getting a unit of Hesder soldiers, like that's a good thing, right? And they know they're getting a unit of quality soldiers who are committed and dedicated and will raise the morale and the overall even operational efficiency of units because of it. Together with and the same is true for other people that aren't yeshiva. They're like, oh, there are guys coming from Eli, and it's going to be good for us, right? It's good for our unit that we're getting those guys because they're committed. On the other side of things, I will say one thing that Hesder has done in the Dati Leumi world is that it has raised and improved the level of Talmidei Chachamim, right? Before Hesder, the average Dati Leumi person probably was actually from a kibbutz and then went to the army and was in the army and maybe studied before and maybe learned afterwards. But the situation on the whole then was that a lot of the Ramim and Rabbanim later on were Haredi in the various places. But the Hesder Yeshivot, because it essentially became a very popular track, has created a significant cadre of the Dati Leumi rabbis who are at a very high level, and the yeshivot themselves are kinds of very important places of learning and development for the Dati Leumi world, if that makes sense. So from that aspect as well, it's important. Again, it's obviously, I don't know if the state of Israel cares so much about that, right? But the Dati Leumi certainly does. That you can see how the yeshivot has impacted the level of Torah learning and knowledge in the Dati Leumi world as a whole. Like if you take where I live in Israel, my neighbors, I would say 90% of them, not all of them were Hesder, but 90% of them spent 5 or 6 years in yeshiva, right? And served in the army. And a large percentage of them were are still today commanders in the army and in reserves, right? And so for the Dati Leumi community, it's actually a very important sociological place for the growing of Talmidei Chachamim, and it's impacted the community in important ways as well. Shmuel, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so I had an interesting conversation with my son, he's in a combat unit. He's actually serving in guarding duties in Somet Gush at the moment, and
was he there was he involved in that stabbing where the guy was shot?
Yeah, it was his roommate who shot the terrorist. Yeah,
really.
He told me the whole story about what happened there. It was really interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But he ran to the scene. So
that's where I do my shopping.
Yeah. So he says it's an area where Jews and Arabs go shopping. So and it's often a target, unfortunately, as well, of terrorist attacks. He's found that this combat role has been much more meaningful than the training period where he was kind of frustrated. But despite the fact that it's been meaningful, but he's actually now looking for a transfer to another role, and he's looking to be moved to the international relations department of Tzahal in Tel Aviv, where he'd been a kind of propaganda role. Now he made an interesting comment to me about that.
Of truth. What's the
Yes, probably. Yeah, all right, okay. So he made an interesting comment to me about that. He said actually, and by the way, he's very proud to be a combat soldier. But he said actually, in the bigger scheme of things, the public relations role is at least as important, if not more important, to Israel's safety and security than what he's doing guarding duties at Summit Gush. So that's a very interesting comment in the context of this discussion, because a Haredi would argue here, that who's not serving in the army, that, well, look, you know, the learning of Torah is of such value that who's to say, I mean, from a Torah perspective, that the learning of Torah is not more significant in the safety and security of the state, or as at least important as somebody who's serving in a combat unit. You come back to the same argument, which is a very different way of looking at it from what Rav Lichtenstein is saying. He's looking at the personal responsibility of the individual, but this is looking at it more from the global perspective of what is actually more effective or most effective.
I would just say a couple of things. The one thing is definitely that, you know, different combat isn't the be all and all of the army. Far from it, in fact, right? Most people are not combat soldiers, and actually, you know, even as kind of how should I say it? You know, as risque as it sounds to, you know, get up and stand on the border. Actually, most times you're just trying to keep yourself awake and hope you don't get caught, like with an eye closed or something, because it's boring, and it really is boring. You know, someone told me that who was in the American army in the Korean War. He was drafted, and someone told me his father was drafted, and Rav Shechter, not the Rav Shechter now, the Rav Shechter who actually was very close with my wife's grandfather, because he was a combat soldier in World War II. But he was sent to Korea, and Rav Shechter said, take some mishnayot with you, right? To like do, you know, and he's like, what am I going to do with mishnayot? It's the army. He's like, you'll see. That he finished like Shas a number of times while he was in the army, because oftentimes even in combat roles it's very, very boring, and there's a lot of time. And so obviously, you know, it isn't just combat or nothing, and everyone plays an important role in the military. But I will say there's something to be said. Firstly, for the premise that that the Haredi learning yeshiva is fulfilling the same kind of role. I'm not sure we can say that definitively all the time. I'm also not sure we can say definitively, and this is more to the point, that it's specifically the Haredi Torah that's taking place in a particular yeshiva, which is defending the nation, as opposed to the Torah of the simple Yid who's sitting in between meetings in the Tel Aviv Ministry of Defense and learning a few pages of Mishnah. I'm not sure which Torah protects more or less. And there is something else which I'll say, which I only understood really once I had been in the military, and that is, when you're in the military, you're in the military, right? Whether you're in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, whether you're on a guard duty in Gush Etzion, or whether you're getting prepared to go into Gaza, you're in the military. And that means they can call you whenever they want. It means you're in a uniform. It means if you don't come, you can go to jail, right? And it means that you have a weapon on you and you're a target. And you know, the time I realized I really understood the military was in the middle of my military service. I was granted leave to fly to Australia, and I was on the plane between the United States and Australia, sitting next to a guy who was in the Australian Air Force. This guy in Iraq, Dafka. And he said how good the Israeli equipment is. It helped them a lot in battles, apparently. I don't know. So he says to me, I said, where are you going? He's like, well, actually, my sister's getting married, and I'm going to give her away because our father passed away. And he said, it was very nice of them to let me go. They didn't have to let me go, right? And when he said that, I said to myself, that's exactly the mindset as well of the Israeli military, right? You're lucky if they let you out. right? You're lucky. You're literally in their hands. They can do with you whatever they want. The difficulty of the military isn't the ability to run 10 kilometers or go for a 90-kilometer march with 40 kilograms on your back. The difficulty of the military is that they tell you after being in the desert literally for 4 weeks and not showering just because you're training, and they say you're going home for Shabbat, and you're on the bus getting ready to go for Shabbat, and they get a call and they say, no, we need extra people to stay on the base this week. We're not going anywhere. That's the difficulty of the military. And with all due respect, the people who are learning in yeshivot, that's not the mindset in yeshivot. And it's very far from the mindset in yeshivot. Not getting into the other questions and everything else, tachlis, it's not the same. It's not the same. The obligation is not the same. The mechuyavut is not the same. The feeling of being controlled is not the same. Of being dedicated to the defense of the country is not the same. And I'm being very honest, to be honest. but I think that's true. I think that's true. And I think it's unavoidable. Someone who's sitting in yeshiva, and even if and I know there are people in yeshiva because I've met them who really do see learning as that kind of obligation and they're committed to it. It's definitely not everyone. But on the other hand, everyone in the military, whether they want to or not, is obligated to follow orders. And if they don't, they go to jail, literally to jail, right? And they sit there for a week or a month or a year or however long it takes. And it's a different framework. It's incomparable. Mm. And by the way, also, Hesder isn't only combat, right? Also, some guys don't have the profile and they take them to do other jobs as well. But, So, on that note, does anyone else want to say anything? Or what do you think, Shmuel?
Yeah, so I mean, they would probably... they might argue that the highest level of Torah study is more significant than, as you say, the Jew taking out a Mishnayos in between meetings. That they would maybe say that the very highest level of Torah study that's achieved by full-time Torah learners in the top Kohalim is very, very significant and shouldn't be interfered with. That would probably be the argument.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not holding in those sources, so.
Yeah.
No, but I'm saying I'm not sure where that idea comes from, to be honest.
But I think yeah.
And I'm not sure what I'm not sure how we could prove that.
But even if that were true, there was one of the I think it was Yesh Atid who came up with a policy that there should be a fixed number of Torah studies who the state would grant an exemption to, whether it was 1,000 or 10,000 or whatever the number was. But if that were true, if it were just the very top level of Torah students, then the state could probably kind of say, okay, we'll give that. But that's not what's being demanded by the Haredi community. They're saying, well, we want everyone to be exempt, which is much harder when you have a growing community like that. I think it's more a question of the social cost, really. That's really the issue. Is the way that the rest of society are going to respond to that kind of demands.
I'll say more than I saw a study a number of years ago. I don't know if it was accurate or not, but they said that if the Haredi population joined the army in the same percentages as the secular population, which is not 100% in the secular population either, that the length of military service would be cut down from 3 years to 2 years. Right? So think about what that means. What does that mean to a secular person to have a year of their life? That's forget about the danger, which is obviously another issue to all. Is like that's like a serious thing. A year of someone's life. That's a serious thing. And I don't. Again, being completely honest, I don't understand it. I don't understand it. I don't know. I obviously understand the need for a strong group of Torah learners in society and for Torah to be central and to encourage as much Torah learning as possible. But for people to say, across the board, our community doesn't serve in the army, with all forget about everything with Zionism, everything else, it's something, in the words of to paraphrase Rav Lichtenstein, I don't find it morally engaging. It's something I can't understand. I hope I'm not being too honest, but I'm saying It's very difficult for me to understand that out of everything. But again, it's better. You know, I also think Rothstein very clearly showed the way. I don't think it's good to dwell on others. It's more important to think about what we can all do in that sense, I guess. So anyway, so on that note, we'll end. And I think these questions, again, just to kind of round off the discussion, these are very important debates which impact people's lives directly today, right? But I think for us, what's very important, interesting about them, is how through those debates we can see ways of navigating through difficult situations, or navigating through kind of dual tensions or dual weights which are placed upon us in the modern world. The modern world have kind of presented to us, and to think about how we navigate through them, not specifically this issue, but in general the issues of, you know, how do you navigate between changing circumstances, between a new issue such as drafting to an army in general, which is a modern issue, and how do the poskim deal with that, and what does it mean in the modern state of Israel, and how are we meant to navigate that, also how are we meant to have an argument about that in the right way as well, which I think is also very important to learn and to think about as well. And so on that note, we'll finish for this evening, unless anyone wants to say anything. But thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Okay, good to see everyone.
Amazing. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.